This is the Traveling While Undocumented, Understanding Your Rights webinar. And we are going to start with a little overview, roadmap, if you will, of what you can expect us to cover today. We will start with a disclaimer, some background info and intros about who we are, a few scenarios, some action steps and preparation resources, and then we'll end with Q&A. Again, the audio is disabled because we had a lot of people register. So if you do have a question as we're going through content, just feel free to pop it into the Q&A. We'll be answering those as they come up. And then we'll also have time at the end to answer common questions that keep recurring or ones that we don't get to in the Q&A. So the chat and Q&A function are your friends for today. So, brief disclaimer before we dive into content. The information in this webinar does not constitute legal advice. While two of us here are licensed immigration attorneys, we are not providing anyone specific legal advice. What we are doing is providing general legal information about your rights and what you could potentially do in these different situations if you happen to find yourself in them. We can't answer any questions about individual cases or, how something might affect you in particular as an individual, but we can answer very general questions, again, about the content that we are presenting on and any clarifying or additional information that would be helpful. So just putting that there, because usually we always get like, well, my uncle, and like we can't we can't answer questions about your uncle or your cousin or that one time this happened to you. But what we can do is clarify anything that was confusing, and provide additional information or examples about the information we are providing today. So now that the disclaimer is out of the way, I want to just let Veronica get us started with intros. So take it away, Veronica.
Hi, everyone, and welcome. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Veronica Garcia. I'm a staff attorney with the Immigrant Legal Resource Center, and I'm happy to be here today. So feel free to send us your questions and hope that you'll find the information we provide useful.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jesús. I am the Legal Services Programming Lead at Immigrants Rising. As a fellow traveler, I'm very excited for just sharing a little bit more about the information we have gathered within Immigrants Rising and just also our personal experiences with traveling. And yeah, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Denia Perez.
Sorry, y'all, my mouse continues to get ahead of us, so apologies for that. My name is Zenia Perez, pronouns she, her, Director of Legal Services here at Immigrants Rising. I'm also a DACA recipient, and yeah, I'm looking forward to this webinar and to answer questions to hopefully help you all feel prepared and excited about any travels you might be planning. So just a little bit of background info. We did include this in the email blast we sent out and in our social media posts, but again, just a little bit of history of how we got here. So undocumented people with and without DACA have been traveling and should be traveling if you are able, because it's exciting. Travel opens up new opportunities and ways to learn about yourself and others that, staying in your bubble maybe doesn't. And so we wanted just to provide information to empower people to do so safely and to do so in a way that they feel prepared in case of any potential interaction with TSA or CBP. So hopefully you leave this webinar feeling like you have a good understanding of potential scenarios you might encounter and how you can respond. To know what your rights are while you're traveling, and again, to feel empowered and excited versus, maybe scared or nervous about traveling. So that is our goal for today. And before we dive in, we wanted to just do like a really quick poll. So feel free to scan this QR code and answer the question. I'll give you all about a minute to do that. Use the code if you need, and answer the poll so that we can get started with the scenarios. Okay, I'm gonna stop share for 1 second so that I can pull up the poll results. Give me 1 moment. Oh,
As Denia does that, I'm looking at the responses from everyone, and it's looking pretty great. It's looking like folks are adding quite a few places that they want to travel to. Okay, there you go.
yes. I see Hawaii, California, New York is pretty big.
Wow.
So yeah, this is pretty diverse. Colorado, you guys see we have some outdoorsy folks. This is great.
Hawaii, I don't know about you, Dania. What do you think? Is Hawaii the biggest one?
I think, yeah, it looks like Hawaii, New York, and maybe California. Puerto Rico is also up there. Oh, it's
Yeah.
getting
Yeah.
smaller. Um, okay. Well, this is great. We love that you are all already thinking about where you want to travel. I'm going to stop share for just a second so that I can go back to the PowerPoint and then hand it over to Jesús.
Thank you, everyone who participated. And I think I also saw Florida as one of the options that was like also very popular. And we'll be talking a little bit about later on in the presentation about traveling to states that have enacted some anti-immigrant policies. So we'll be addressing that later on. But first, we wanted to address the first scenario. So this presentation is kind of split off into different scenarios of just things that could happen when traveling. So the first one that I wanted to share is actually something that happened to me not too long ago when going through the Transportation Security Administration, also known as TSA. And in this situation, it's the TSA agent at an airport is flipping through your passport and asks to see a visa or additional immigration documents. So this is something that happened to me, and thankfully, because I'm well informed and I travel frequently, I was able to go through this scenario without like freaking out at that moment. So Denia, do you mind going on to the next slide, please? Thank you. So first, I wanted to address that undocumented folks can travel domestically, and they can do so regularly with or without DACA. And this presentation will be addressing how you can do so in a safe manner. So you can stay informed and you can just say, okay, well, if I want to travel, these are the ways that I can do so in an informed way. So first, TSA allows many forms of identification. So in this scenario, the TSA agent was flipping through your passport and asks for other immigration documents or other forms of identification. So something important to know is that TSA not only accepts like foreign passports that are unexpired. So like if you're from Bangladesh, it also accepts like a passport from Bangladesh that's still current, that's not expired. But then there are also other forms of identification, like your state ID. If you have like DACA, there's also the employment authorization card that you get. There's different forms of identification. If you want to know more about these different forms of identification, it's in the next slide, and I'll be sharing some examples of those as well. And the other thing to know is if you're questioned about your immigration status or your citizenship status, you do not have to answer to those questions. So you can say, I don't have to answer those questions if the TSA agent asks for that, or if Immigration and Customs Enforcement asks you those questions, or Customs and Border Patrol. But before I go into that, I also want to note the differences between those. So the Transportation Security Administration, or TSA agents, those are the agents that pretty much look into your document to make sure that you are who you say you are, and to also make sure that you do not pose a threat to yourself or others while in the airport. And then there's also the Immigration and Customs Enforcement. So that is the enactment, or like the enforcing of immigration laws within the US. And then there's also the Customs and Border Patrol, which is the enforcement of immigration laws at or between ports of entry to the US. So that's just a distinction between those three. And again, you don't have to answer questions about your citizenship or immigration status. However, if you deny to answer those questions, it could lead to more questioning, or they could detain you. So I think it's always good to always have like a number of an immigration attorney in your pocket or in your phone. And I think we'll be addressing some of the emergency contacts, but in case of those situations, it's always good to have a number of someone that can be there in case you have questions about like, hey, should I answer this question? Or do I need to sign anything? So we'll be addressing some of those things in the other slides as well. But Dania, do you mind going to the next slide, please? So other considerations that you should think about when traveling is to make sure that when you book your flight, the ticket also aligns with your identification. So sometimes it doesn't happen very often, but sometimes I hear stories of people that say, oh, my birth date is different from the one that I put on my ticket, on my flight ticket. So that could also raise a flag for the TSA agent. And then also sometimes people tend to like misspell their names, or maybe they leave out something from their ticket. So that's also something to think about. I always double check before booking my flight. I always make sure that all the information is correct before doing so, because if you don't, that could present some challenges later on. And then if some TSA agent denies your accepted form of ID, something you can always do is pull up your TSA acceptable documents and say, hey, this is actually an acceptable document that's listed on the TSA website. And that could also just let them know that, hey, this is a form of ID that it's totally acceptable, and therefore they should accept it as well. And I'll be putting on the chat as well the website that you can go to. It's also in the resources that we'll be sharing within the last slides of this presentation. But I'll put it on the chat as well, so you can just take a look at those as we go through this presentation. And then another thing to consider is to secure your devices. So turn off face identification and turn on numerical password. The reason why is so the TSA agents can also ask for your phone to like turn in your phone, but you're not required to share the password of your phone. So it's important because if you have like Face ID, they can just face it to you, and then that will unlock your phone. But it's also a good idea to maybe when you're traveling, maybe going through a TSA entry, you can also just turn that off and just put it on numerical password. Like that, you don't have to share the password with them, and they don't have to look through your phone. And then lastly, develop a safety plan. And a safety plan can entail many things. The way I like to design my safety plan is to have at least 2 emergency contacts in case I ever need to call somebody, in case I'm in like, I don't know, I'm being questioned by someone, or in case I don't know how to answer a particular question. Something I like to encourage people to do is if they can add at least one local number of like a immigration attorney to the place that they're traveling to, I like to Google rapid response networks in the area that I'm traveling to, in case I do need to have like someone pull up like right away, in case I'm in like a crisis. And also like someone that you trust in case you're being asked for like additional documentation, and someone that can have access to your important documents at home. So it's always good to have at least 2 points of contact in case of any situation like that. Next slide, please. And these are some examples of some forms of identification that you can present through TSA. So adult passengers of the age of 18 years old or older should present one form of valid identification to TSA to be able to travel. So some of these documents are, for example, a driver's license or other form of like state ID. And as of May 7 of 2025, Real ID is going to be enforced, where if you're planning to use a driver's license or a state ID, it will have to be Real ID compliant. But before then, you can just use your state ID or driver's license without having it being Real ID. It's not until May 7th of 2025. Next slide, please. Thank you. And as this scenario shows, there's unexpired foreign passport. I use my Mexican passport sometimes. Just make sure that it's unexpired. Also, important note, other countries put their dates differently. So for example, in Mexico, it starts with the date, then the month, then the year, versus like the US, it's the month, date, year. That's a huge mistake I did when I first started to travel with my passport, with my Mexican passport, because I assumed it was the same as the US. So I didn't realize that when I was traveling with my passport, I was about to, thankfully I noticed before I went through TSA, I was about to use an expired passport because I thought that the date was a month. And I think someone put it on the chat too. It's day, month, and year for example, like the Mexican passport, because that's the way they think about dates. So make sure you research, what does your foreign passport dates look like? And then make sure that it's unexpired before going through TSA. The other thing to know is you can also use a state driver's license, as I mentioned in the previous slide, or a state ID. Before May 7, 2025, it doesn't have to be Real ID compliant. I know Real ID may leave out some undocumented folks. For example, like I think DACA folks have to show that they have some form of immigration status. But before then, before May 7, 2025, you don't have to show that it's Real ID compliant. After May 7, 2025, if you are planning to use a state driver's license or a state ID, it does need to be Real ID compliant. So look into your state's DMV website and look at the requirements. And I recommend get started on that today. Look at what you need to do. If you are eligible for a Real ID, look into it because the process might be a little longer. They do ask for a little bit more information. And then employment authorization card from USCIS. So that's I also use it too regularly. It's your employment work authorization that you get, for example, if you were granted asylum, or if you, for example, if your parents are adjusting status, they give you a work authorization in the meantime. So it's like a card, and it has your birthday, it has different things, like your face. That's also a form of accepted form of ID. So that's one example. And then there's a border crossing card, or tarjeta de cruce fronterizo. So those are just some examples of TSA approved forms of ID. And let's see, I see some incredible questions being asked. Hopefully at maybe the end of scenario 2, we'll address some of those. And if not, more towards the end. So the second scenario, and this is a very popular one as we got in like the poll that we asked in the beginning, and this is if you're planning to travel to or back from states like Alaska or Hawaii or US territories like Puerto Rico. So this is just one example. Puerto Rico is just one US territory. There are other US territories as well. So do your research before you travel. So going into the next slide. So before you travel, and I separated this into going into like Alaska or Hawaii, and then the next one is going to be US territories like Puerto Rico. But first, what is considered a domestic flight? And you can add it on the chat as well. But I put these two examples of just what is considered a domestic flight. So a domestic flight is within the US without having a layover or destination in another country. So for example, it could be like traveling to LA, Los Angeles, and arriving to places like Austin, Texas, or like Miami, Florida, or Seattle, Washington. I know a very popular flight, at least here in California, is if you want to go to Las Vegas, Nevada. That's also if you're traveling from like San Francisco, California to Las Vegas, Nevada, that's a domestic flight. And if you're traveling to Hawaii or Alaska, that is also considered a domestic flight. So something that a lot of people fail to realize is that Hawaii is actually a state within the US. Alaska is as well. Something tricky to note, though, is that sometimes when traveling to either of these states, there may be layovers in other countries, like Canada, or maybe in like an island. So just make sure that when you're booking your flight, there aren't any layovers in other countries, because that's when it becomes tricky and it automatically doesn't become a domestic flight. So just make sure that everything stays domestic. It's a one-way, like no stop flight to Hawaii or Alaska. So just make sure you look at those when you're booking your flight as well. And then I see a question from someone that says, so if we are undocumented, can we travel to Hawaii and can we use our driver's license? So that's a really good question. And it's a question we get a lot too. So if you're undocumented, and I'm going to use that term very loosely, if you're undocumented, traveling to Hawaii is like, for example, if you're in California, it's like traveling to Nevada, right? I think the most important thing though is that you can't take a bus to Hawaii, right? You have to go through an airport to be able to go to Hawaii. So in order to do so, just make sure you have the right documents so that it doesn't make your trip a little bit more challenging. And also, I don't know, when you travel to Hawaii, you want to make sure it's like a stress-free flight. Usually most people go for like vacation. So just make sure that you present the right documents. So if you're fully undocumented, I know I have some friends that use like their driver's license, their state's driver's license. They use like their state ID. They use their foreign passport, right? Like I have a friend from El Salvador and he uses his passport too. Just make sure it's listed as an acceptable form of ID for TSA. And also, let's see, traveling to US territories. So now going into also an exciting part. If you're planning to travel to a US territory, undocumented individuals can travel to US territories without advance parole. However, it's important to know how you can safely travel to those places, right? So traveling to US territories without DACA or TPS, even though a person has never technically left the US, could result in a referral to ICE for removal. So just make sure that like when you're traveling, you know that you have all the documents that you need in case you are detained or in case you are stopped by ICE or Customs and Border Patrol. Make sure that you have documents like your USCIS documents are valid, the entire time you're abroad. So in case, let's use Puerto Rico as an example. If you're planning to go to Puerto Rico, make sure that you have like a USCIS, your documents are valid, and that they do not expire during any of the time you are leaving the US mainland. Even if you have, like, for example, DACA and you have a renewal pending, it's good to, like, when you plan to leave the mainland US, you plan to leave before it expires with no chance of expiring or having any gap in between while you are away outside of US mainland. Also, bring your USCIS documents showing your granted deferred status or any other USCIS like status that you have in order to facilitate your return. So depending on where you travel, you may be subject to certain processes, including like customs inspections. Having proof of your, like if you have DACA, for example, having proof of your granted deferred status can help make this process go smoother. Sometimes there are like officers that ask you for more information. That has never happened to me. I've traveled to Puerto Rico multiple times, but I have heard that it has happened. Like people have asked like, oh, what is your, like, do you have other forms of ID besides like your passport? Because some people use Puerto Rico as a port of entry from other countries. So it's important to also just make sure that you have a secondary form of ID, so you can be able to go back into US mainland. And then lastly, make sure there are no layovers, as I said, outside of the US states and territories. So this is also why I don't like to travel during like weather conditions that might result in like people going to another country, like leaving Puerto Rico as an example, because there might be a hurricane or whatever. So just make sure that there are no layovers or stops in other countries. Make sure it's like a nonstop flight to and from the place that you're going to, the US territory. And then lastly, prepare for your trip to a US territory. And as I mentioned earlier, you can make sure your identity documents are valid during your entire time abroad. This is with or without DACA or TPS. Just make sure that like your documents that you're using don't have any gap or of expiration. And if the expiration is happening, make sure that it expires before and not after your trip or during your trip. Make sure everything is in line so that once you travel, you don't have to worry about the documents being an issue when you're traveling. And then if you have your USCIS documents showing your granted deferred status, bring those. As I said, I like to always keep those with me, just in case the agents at the airport, or in case you're like wherever that you're going, make sure that you have something to present in case someone brings it up. And then make sure there are no layovers outside the US and territory. So that was just like a recap of things that I mentioned. And now I will transition it over to Veronica, who will go into traveling in a state with anti-immigrant laws.
Thanks, Jesús. Before we go in, do we want to answer any of the other questions that came in, or I could just keep going and we could do it at the end?
Yeah, we can go either way. I was also planning on answering them as you were sharing your slide, but we can go. Do you have a preference, Veronica?
No, no preference at all. I just thought that there was a few questions that were coming in around traveling with DACA and not traveling without DACA, and I guess what was domestic travel, right, and what is not domestic travel. I feel like it's also a question that has come up. But we could, yeah, we could go either way.
Yeah, let's I've been trying to answer the ones in the Q&A section. So let's have you continue, Veronica, because a lot of the questions are actually being answered in real time. Like, for example, someone asked about anti-immigrant state. So let's have you do that. And then at the end, we'll uplift the most common questions we keep getting.
Sounds good. Okay. So I'm going to talk a bit about traveling in a state with anti-immigrant laws. And I just want to give a caveat. I know that a lot of questions have come in around how it is to travel in Texas, how it is to travel in Florida. And we will highlight those laws in particular because I feel they're the ones that have gotten either, a lot of news attention, right? Or Texas, because that is the state that has been used as a blueprint for other anti-immigrant laws that have come up in different states. I want to note that we're not going to speak specifically to what the law does, right? The law has a lot of different pieces in it. But we wanted to address more of the concerns that could come up and the rights that someone has if they do encounter a stop in that state while they're traveling, and what they could do to, protect themselves, exert their rights, and make sure that they don't overshare information, right? Because it's really hard to not overshare when you're nervous. I know when I'm nervous, I tend to talk more, right, than when I'm supposed to. So we definitely wanted to highlight that. So just some general questions, right, that we've been hearing and seeing in the chat box around traveling in some of these states, right? So, if there's an anti-immigrant law, what should you keep in mind as you are traveling there, right? Is it safe for undocumented folks to go and travel with, within these states or to these states? And then what happens, right? And what you should keep in mind as you're there. Next slide. So like I mentioned, I'm going to highlight the laws that are right now in Texas and Florida. As many of you know, there have been a lot of other laws that are being passed currently in different states. I believe the most recent one was Iowa, right, that we just saw pass the law. And a lot of these states, like I mentioned, are using Texas as the blueprint, right, of what they could do and what they could, put in the books to criminalize individuals who are undocumented, right? So just really briefly to talk about what is happening in Texas, so that we're all on the same page, right? So Texas, for the past couple of years, the governor passed a program policy called Operation Lone Star, and that essentially is him trying to do a state-led immigration enforcement program, right? So for those of you who are familiar with, immigration law and immigration policy and how it works, immigration policy and law is essentially it's essentially the space for the federal government, right? So only the federal government could create laws and policies of who could get status, who cannot get status, right? Who could be deported, who could stay in the United States, who could enter with what type of visas, etc., right? And the enforcement of those laws is usually left to the federal government, right? So we see that with, different officers that work for the federal government. In Texas, essentially, the governor has created a program, right, to do his own enforcement program and his own enforcement policies, and that has led to different bills that are being passed. I'm not going to go into detail to all the different policies that have, come into existence. We will highlight at the end website that you could visit that talks about what's happening with Operation Lone Star, what has come out of Operation Lone Star, and some know your rights toolkits that people could use, and teach others, right, to protect themselves. I'm going to highlight the two bills that I feel recently have been getting a lot of attention, right? The first one is SB4, right? So there's different SB4s in Texas, and it could get a little confusing, but the first one, SB4, the one that's talked about as the deportation bill. And essentially, right, when this passed and was signed into law, the law would authorize, right, untrained officers to engage in immigration enforcement, right, the ability to arrest, detain, and then help in the deportation process. It permitted police officers in Texas, right, to detain people that they suspected of being non-U.S. citizens, right, entering or attempting to enter Texas without authorization. And it authorized local judges in Texas to deport people. I want to note that this law is not currently in effect, right? It is being challenged right now in court, right? So it's not in effect right now, but I did want to note that this is something that passed. The other one is SB4, the human smuggling, right? Or the mandatory minimum, right? I want to note that Texas had something in its books now for a while, but it recently changed to broaden the definition of what would be considered human smuggling and what would be the consequence, right, if an officer or someone finds you and thinks that you are smuggling someone, right? So bringing someone unlawfully into Texas. And I want to note those because the way that when you're traveling and you interact, right, with the law enforcement officer, right, it's the transportation piece and how that could impact you as you travel to Texas. Next slide. The other law, right, that we're going to briefly talk about is Florida, right? So we saw that SB 1718 was passed, and that one also is similar, right, to the Texas one. It criminalizes being undocumented in different aspects and spaces. Some of the key findings of this law, right? The first one is that it forces hospitals to inquire about immigration status, right? So it could be added to the intake sheet when somebody goes and seeks medical attention. I do want to note that it does not bar people from seeking healthcare, right? So people could still go and seek healthcare, but it does open up the possibility of being asked about your immigration status. It criminalizes undocumented immigrants from traveling in and out of Florida, right? I want to note that the law applies for people who are traveling across state lines, right? So you're traveling into Florida. And it's mostly in the sense of when you're driving, right? Because the other aspect of this law is that it invalidates out-of-state licenses issued to undocumented immigrants, right? So someone who is traveling from California and they have the undocumented license, that wouldn't be valid in Florida, right? So if you're driving and you're stopped and you're asked for identification, that could be, you could be charged, right, for driving without a license, and that could lead to other consequences. And then also, it's allowing for the expelling of migrants out of Florida. So we've heard, right, in the news of individuals being flown to other states, right, or sent to other states via bus if they are in Florida and they are undocumented. Next slide. Okay, so what can we do if we are in these, states with anti-immigrant laws, right? Every law is different and how it applies and the punishments that are applied are different, but the rights that someone has within those states are the same, right? So regardless of whether you're a US citizen or you're undocumented or you have DACA or you're waiting for an asylum case, it's important to know that you have rights under the Constitution, and it's important to know which rights to exert and how to exert them if you are stopped by a police officer or someone seeking your immigration status. The most important one, and I'm sure many of you have heard in other spaces, right, is that you have the right to remain silent, right? So even if they ask you questions, you do not have to answer those questions. You are not required to answer questions about where you were born, whether you're a US citizen, or how you entered the country. You have a right to seek legal representation. If you are in a criminal case proceedings, you have a right to an attorney, whether you could pay for them or not, right? They should give you access to an attorney in a criminal proceedings. Unfortunately, in immigration, you have a right to an attorney, but if you can't afford one will not be assigned to you, so you have to find one. And there's various nonprofits who defend and take cases, right, from individuals, so definitely seek those out. You have a right to not sign anything. So sometimes when you are arrested or detained, officers will tell you that you have to sign what they have presented to you. You don't have to sign it. You could speak to someone before you move forward and you sign anything or make any decision in your case. Next slide. So what can you do if you're stopped while driving in one of these states, right? So if you were stopped because an officer believes that there has been a traffic violation or there's some sort of checkpoint, they could stop you and they may ask you for your driver's license, right? So they have a right to ask you for that. If you choose not to provide one, which you can remain silent and you can choose to not provide information. They may ask you other questions, right? To provide your name, your driver's license number, where you live or date of birth. But like I mentioned, you don't have to answer the questions. You could stay silent and either wait or ask to speak to someone else. If they're asking you questions and you choose to answer the questions, right, or you give them the driver's license, remember that you do not have to answer questions about your place of birth or your immigration status or how you entered the United States. Do remember not to use false documents. And also, if you're traveling with someone, let's say that you do have documents and you're traveling with someone who is undocumented, your passenger should not be asked questions and they should not have to provide identification, right? Because you are the one that was stopped. Some of the things that you could say, right, if you are stopped and you have an interaction with a police officer, like I mentioned, you have a right to remain silent, right? So you could say that you wish to remain silent and not answer any further questions. And if you want to know if you're able to leave or not, it's also important to ask, or state that you are going to leave now if you are not being arrested, right? Or if you're not under arrest. And sometimes you'll have to ask these a few times or state them a few times because not all officers will be as cooperative as they should be, but know that you are able to do that. Next slide. So what to do if you are stopped while walking? Very similar as if you're stopped while driving, right? Let's say that you're walking and someone stops you because they suspect that you are up to something that's, unlawful, right? Or you did something that broke a law and they wanted to question you, right? Or search you. You once again, have a right to remain silent, right? So you could state that again, that you wish to remain silent and not answer any further questions. Once again, you do not have to answer questions regarding your name, your place of birth, your immigration status, or how you entered the United States. And once again, you could ask them if you're able to leave if you're not being arrested, right? If you're not arrested, you do not have to identify yourself, right? So you do not have to give them information about who you are, or where you are, why you're there, or what's happening. Next slide. If by any chance you are arrested, just note, that it's important to ask to speak to an attorney. If you don't understand what's being asked of you, you could ask, that you want to speak to an attorney and you're not going to sign anything, or you need translation for what's happening before you make any decision on your case. Dania, can you go one back? Sorry. And don't give explanations of what's happening or why you're there, what you were doing, right? And don't make any decisions about your case before you speak to an attorney. It's very important, right? It's your case, it's your decision, right? But it's definitely important to have all the information and all the defenses that you could possibly seek in some of these states, right? So, speaking to an attorney is the best course of action that you could do. And like I mentioned, right, if you don't understand what's being presented to you or told to you, you could ask for an interpreter or someone to translate for you. Next slide. This is similarly what we spoke about earlier, right? So an officer stops you. Like I mentioned, everybody has rights under the Constitution. You could state clearly, right, that you wish to not speak with them. You could answer their questions or sign any documents. And this is based on your Fifth Amendment right under the United States Constitution. If you're asked to sign a document, right, you could say that you want to speak to an attorney before answering any more questions or signing anything around those laws. Next slide. If you are traveling in those states or you live in those states, one really important thing to do is to understand exactly how the laws will impact you or how they affect you. Like I mentioned, the one in Florida is full in effect, right? It usually targets, individuals who are traveling into Florida, right? It's trying to gather information about someone who's undocumented, right? And seeing how they could speed up the process of having someone be deported because of that. So it's important to know who it affects, when it affects you, and when it doesn't affect you, right? To understand what your defenses might be. If you do have to travel in the States, or if you're traveling in the States, right, it's important to check the travel route, right? So what counties will you be crossing? Are there any checkpoints on that route that you are taking? Is there a possibility that you have to stop? If you do have to stop, where do you have to stop, and what county will that fall? In the resources that we'll talk about later, as it pertains to the state of Texas, there is a map about counties, right? And those policies, that exist in the counties, which ones have more anti-immigrant policies and laws, which ones have less, right? And it's a good resource to look at as you are traveling around that state, just because of the different laws that exist, it could impact you differently in the different counties that you're in. If you are stopped, right, remember your rights, that you don't have to answer questions about your status, and you can remain silent, and have a plan around how you will answer those questions or not answer those questions if you are stopped. And most importantly, create a plan, right? So if you are arrested, who can you contact? Do you know the number of someone that you could call, right? If you are arrested and detained, is there a plan in place, right? What documents will you need? Do you have any pending cases before immigration that you would want to, you know, have the documents for? Do you already have an attorney that you could contact? Do you have a number, memorized that you could call in the case of an emergency? If you have family members that need to be notified, do you have that information so you can notify them? Next slide. So I will leave it there and see if, and pass it over to Denia to talk about some resources.
Thank you, Veronica. Oh, sorry, y'all. My computer has a mind of its own. So there were a lot of really great questions coming in both through the Q&A and the chat that were being addressed in real time. So just one of the common ones that kept coming up was, you know, I don't have DACA, I'm fully undocumented, no TPS, no nothing. Like, can I travel with my passport? And the answer is yes. As Jesus mentioned, unexpired, just make sure it is unexpired. Passports from your country of origin are an acceptable form of identification now and after the Real ID goes into effect. So even after Real ID goes into effect, your unexpired passport will remain an acceptable form of ID that you can use when you are flying. So that was one of the most common questions. Like, well, I don't have DACA, like I don't have an EAD, like, can I use my passport? Yes. Yes, you can. I'll let Veronica and Jesus answer some of the other Q&A questions. But while they do that, we want to just try to summarize all of this great information that we presented to you and do a little bit of action items for you all to help implement or sort of practice what you heard today. So 3 ways that you can prepare for travel is by identifying 1 or 2 TSA-approved identity documents you can use for travel. And if you don't currently have one, we encourage you to apply for one. As Jesus mentioned, there is a TSA website that has examples and has a list of TSA-approved documents that you can use when you are flying domestically. So Jesus, if you want to put that link in the chat, again, if you don't have one or if you don't know what that list is, one thing you can do after today and to prepare for your travels is check out the website. Look at the examples that they list, because the more you know, sometimes we're the ones educating these officers, right? And Jesus said, you know, sometimes an officer will say like, well, do you have another form of ID? And you can say, no, but this is listed on your website. Here it is. This is an example. And sometimes we have to do some of that educating and advocating. So that is one thing you all can do. The second thing we can do is create a safety plan with emergency contacts. So I saw some really great questions in Q&A about, you know, I don't have an attorney, like where can I find one? How do you create an emergency contact network? How do you connect with people? So there is a website called immigrationlawhelp.org where you can plug in your zip code and it populates a list of nonprofit legal services providers in your area. You can also go to alalawyer.com and look up private immigration attorneys in your area. If you've never gotten a consultation, you know, maybe this is the time to do that as well. Because as we all know, not everyone was eligible for DACA, and even folks who have it, you know, we're waiting on this court decision that may or may not impact the program. So that's one way to find legal services providers in your area, is to visit both of those websites. In addition to lawyers, you probably also want to have a number memorized. I am ashamed to say I do not have my parents' cell phone memorized. In case of an emergency, my high school best friend, because for whatever reason, that is the only number I have memorized, but she happens to be one of my emergency contacts. She knows I'm undocumented. She knows, you know, where all my documents are. So she is part of my emergency contacts. Like if you don't have someone's phone number who you trust memorized, that is the next step for you, because if you don't have access to your phone and you have to use, you know, the old dial-up phones, you will not have your contacts. So you really should memorize at least 1, if not 2, numbers of trusted people who you would be able to call in case of an emergency. The third way that you can prepare for your travels is to become familiar with the laws affecting travelers, especially in the states you're thinking of traveling to or from. This webinar is being recorded. We're going to put it on our YouTube. So if you spaced out or you forgot, it is a lot of information. It will be available on our YouTube channel so that you can reference it. We're also going to be sharing other links and resources that you can check out in order to prepare and to understand what the laws are. So that's 3 things you can do for yourself. 3 ways you can support others is by sharing the preparedness resources, which is on the next slide, with your loved ones. Again, we will have these linked and we'll share this out to folks who registered for the webinar, but we have it on the next slide as well. Share those with people you know, friends, family, community. The second thing you can do is visit endlonestar.com. It's a website that the ILRC created to, again, raise awareness about this operation currently happening in Texas that is related to some of these anti-immigrant laws. You can go there to see how you can plug in, get involved, and just learn more about what's happening in Texas. And then another thing you can do is help a friend or loved one apply for or renew their identity documents. Maybe your parents or elders or friends don't have a passport or don't have an ID and they've just haven't gotten around to it because they're intimidated by the process. Helping someone apply for an identity document could be a way that you could implement some of the information that we shared today. As I mentioned, we have these examples of preparedness resources. These are all on our websites, which again, we'll put at the Q&A section. So if you forget, you can just go to our websites. All of these are available there, but some that we wanted to uplift is the Traveling While Undocumented guide, which again, has a lot of this information already in that guide. It's pretty comprehensive, both about types of identity documents, layovers, what's considered domestic versus international flight. We have ILRC's Know Your Rights Toolkit, which again includes a lot of that great information Veronica shared today. You can also look at the Texas Travel Advisory for folks who had specific questions about traveling to or within Texas. It's a really great community-facing resource that was written for people in the community to just understand the lay of the land and what to be aware of if they're traveling to and within Texas. And then the ACLU has really great Know Your Rights at U.S. airports and ports of entry guide. The ACLU of California has a Know Your Rights guide on if you're traveling via bus or a train. We talked a lot about TSA and flying, but a lot of people travel through bus or Amtrak, and sometimes CBP will board trains or buses and ask for people's identity documents. And what do you do in that situation? So we want to highlight these resources as additional reading to reinforce some of the information you all heard today. And then last but not least, if you do live in California and you are affiliated or a student of a community college, you can go to findyourally.com and get legal services. You can get a screening. If you have DACA, need help with the renewal, they can help you with that, or family-based petitions. So again, all of this is on our website, but we'll also be sharing this out with the people who registered for our webinar if you're a little panicked about writing this all down.
Dania, before we end, I also wanted to answer a good question, especially for minors traveling, especially through like TSA. I know we had that question, and I know it's kind of rare to find that being answered in other spaces. So if you have a minor traveling, for example, if they want to fly, they want to board an airplane. So unaccompanied minors aged 5 through 14 traveling alone are not required to show ID at the time of check-in. However, airlines do encourage that they carry some form of ID during travel. And then for minors that are aged 15 through 17, that are traveling alone, need one of the following, which is like a driver's license, a passport, a credit card, school ID, a library card. So those are just some examples. And I'm just sharing like what, for example, United Airlines has shared on their website, and I'll put it on the chat as well. So if you have a minor that you're just kind of worried about what documents they may need, I just put it on the chat, just a link in case you want to look into that a little bit more. Sorry, go ahead, Dania.
No. This is the Q&A section. So yeah, in the last 15 minutes, we want to just answer questions. So thank you for kicking us off, Jesús. Yeah, I think we can just go through. So just really quickly on translation, and then I'll let Veronica answer some of the Texas and Florida ones. So we do not have this in other languages, sadly, but we will be publishing this on our YouTube channel. And I know on YouTube, when you watch something on YouTube, you can actually get closed captions in whatever language you want. So if you want to watch it later or share it with someone who doesn't speak English and they can read, you can turn on closed captions in other languages on YouTube. But sadly, we were not able to offer interpretation for this live version.
So I'll just answer a question that has come up a lot, and I was going to answer them individually, but I'm just going to do it for the whole group. There was a lot of questions around whether it's safe to fly into Florida and Texas, right? Since what I reviewed was around driving, right? If you stop for driving. I just want to note that these laws, essentially what they're doing is they're attempting to criminalize being undocumented, right? So they're trying to identify people who are undocumented. And there's different points where someone will try to ask you about your immigration status, or you will be required to offer some sort of identification that they might use to say that you are undocumented, right? So flying in, it would be the same things that Jesús went over, right? So when you fly, they require you to show an ID when you fly. Usually flying domestic, when you land in a different city or state, they don't ask you for identification once you've landed. They ask you when you check into your flight, right? So if you're flying into Texas, they shouldn't ask you for more information, right, than what you presented. Let's say if you're flying out of San Francisco, right, because that's where you checked in for your flight. But there are these laws in the books, right, that if they go into full effect after the litigation, that there'll be different individuals who could stop you and ask you about your immigration status, right? So it's just something to keep in mind. People live there, right, and they're living and working, and there's great organizations and great work happening in places like Texas and Florida. So I definitely encourage all of you to please go to the links we provided. The End Lone Star link, for example, has a great Know Your Rights resource of what people could do and how the law would apply in different areas and defenses that people could have in case they are stopped, right? So, you know, if you are flying or traveling into Florida or Texas or any of the other states who have these anti-immigrant laws, just remember that if you are stopped and asked about your status, it's better to not say anything, right? If you do have status, obviously that's a different analysis, right? A different conversation to have, but it's better to remain silent and to ask to speak to someone, right? If you're going to those states. And, you know, and yeah, just, you know, connect with someone who could either screen you or advise you if you are in those situations. I noted, you know, traveling into Florida, because when someone's driving, if you are stopped, right, by a traffic, because of a traffic violation, or they say you've committed a traffic violation, that's just a point where there's that contact with law enforcement, where there could be that conversation around, you know, what ID you have and what status you might have.
Thank you, Veronica. And yeah, I think another just general question. So we just started the disclaimer of like, this is not legal advice. We are not telling you yes, travel or no travel. That is for you to decide for yourself. What we do want to do is just provide you with information so you feel empowered and knowledgeable about traveling. I've seen a few questions in Q&A about like, so would you recommend if someone is undocumented travel, or should we not travel? That is a personal decision. That is for you to make that risk assessment for yourself. the risk is never zero, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't travel, right? And so how we do the traveling in a way that feels empowering is by understanding what our rights are, understanding what documents we need, and then deciding for ourselves like whether or not we want to travel. So that is a very personal decision. And we can't say yes for sure or no, but what we can do is just say, look, so there are some risks depending on where you're traveling, but if something happens, this is what you should do. And so that is our hope for today, is just the takeaway is not yes or no, it's here's information for you to make that decision for yourself, not from a place of fear, but from a place of knowledge, and empowerment. So I just wanted to say that because I saw a few of those and, wanting to just address that. That is something that you all get to decide for yourselves, after this webinar. Another question I saw about, how to prepare safety people in case of an emergency, like what to prepare. That's a great question. So when we talk about like an emergency plan, what we're really saying is like if you get stopped and, are questioned and are held, and they offer you a call, like that's the emergency, right? Is that like you weren't allowed to board your flight, that you're being held for questioning. So then you have to call, your family member or your friend to then, if you have a lawyer, call your lawyer, or if you have memorized your lawyer's phone number, to call your lawyer. So the emergency plan is both, who are you calling first if you are detained? And then making sure that that person or those people have copies of your documents. So if you do have DACA and you didn't have your EAD on you, making sure that your trusted person knows where those documents are or has a copy of those documents, that they have a copy of your itinerary so they know like, okay, this is the flight number, this is the airport they were going out of, essentially the safety plan. And what your emergency contacts are doing is just, they're kind of like on standby, right? And like just waiting to get a text from you saying like, cleared TSA, like I'm good, I boarded my flight. Or, if there's an emergency, they're waiting and, gonna either call a lawyer for you, get copies of your documents to send over, or whatever they have to do. But that's essentially what your safety contact's job is just to make sure that you're able to board and fly safely. And if something happens, that they have access to your documents or can make sure that you get a legal representative as fast as they can in case of an emergency. For consulate questions, it really depends on your individual consulate. So, the Mexican consulate has very specific requirements on what you need to get a passport. Obviously, folks are from other countries, not just Mexico. So really, we recommend you visit your consulate's website or you call them to find out what the process is to get a passport. And they will give you more information on what documents you need, but also processing times and how long it usually takes to get a passport. I don't know if Veronica and Jesus, we have like 5 more minutes if either of you want to jump in and answer any of these questions live.
So someone did ask like how will the 2025, like May 7, 2025 Real ID requirement is going to affect travel? I just answered it, but for folks that are planning to use only like a state ID or state driver's license as of May 7, 2025, those forms of document need to be Real ID compliant. That's the change, and that's how it's going to affect traveling. Unfortunately, some folks are not eligible, will not be eligible for the Real ID So, however, as Dania said, this is not like yes or no. It's mostly like that's just one option. And if individuals, for example, are not eligible for the Real ID, there are still other forms of ID that they can present, for example, through TSA. One, for example, I can just think of like, for example, my parents, they may not be eligible for the Real ID. However, they can still use their foreign passport as long as it's unexpired. So that's just one example. If you're only thinking of using a state ID or state driver's license as of May 7, 2025, they will need to be Real ID compliant. However, again, there are still other forms of ID you can present. That's what I wanted to share. Veronica, I think you wanted to also share another Q&A.
Yeah, I just saw that there were several questions around whether there's an emergency stop if you travel to like Alaska, Hawaii, Puerto Rico, etc. I'm curious if any of you have any thoughts. It gets a little tricky, right? And we can definitely not go into the details of what will happen with your case. Before you travel, please go speak to someone, right? Because there are different risks depending on what type of status or not status you have, right? Whether you're a DACA recipient or not a DACA recipient, right? Whether you're traveling with a passport or not. Just because traveling and stopping in a country outside of the United States, right? That's technically leaving the United States. There could be different scenarios, right? If it's an emergency thought. So curious if Daniel Jesus have other thoughts to share, but it's definitely something to consider when you're making travel plans.
Yes, it's a big consideration, or like an emergency. There's a hurricane, or the Caribbean has hurricanes, and like if you have to land in the Dominican Republic or Cuba or something before flying back into the States, like as Veronica said, we can't say specifically, but in general, that is considered a foreign country where you're making that layover. So it could complicate, you re-entering the US after that layover, even if it was an emergency. So again, just something to consider. It does not happen often, but the likelihood is not zero. So even if it's like a small percentage, it's still a possibility. So again, the point is not to scare anyone or discourage you. It's just like for you to be aware that this is something that could happen and understanding like, okay, if this did happen, like what would I do? Would I be okay with that? How would I prepare if something like this did happen?
And I know some folks also asked about this. I know, for example, some states have forms of ID that, for example, like the AB60 driver's license in California, right? Or I believe New York also has a similar state driver's license that undocumented folks take advantage of, like they use for their day-to-day traveling within like their city or whatever. So TSA agents are kind of inconsistent in terms of like whether or not they accept like those forms of ID when going through TSA. So also just keep that in mind. What I always like to encourage folks to do is when in doubt, look through the TSA required documents, because when traveling, you don't want to be like, oh, will they accept it or not? For me, at least for me, like I like to not have like an anxiety attack when making line. I always get super nervous when seeing a TSA officer. So just make sure when in doubt, like consult the TSA website just to make sure that the form of ID that you have is an acceptable form of ID. So for folks in states like New York or California, for example, that do have state issued IDs for folks that are undocumented, like the AB60 driver's license, that is not listed in the TSA acceptable forms of ID. So just also keep that in mind. Even though I have heard many stories, my friends included, that have had those documents being accepted by TSA agents, they are still being inconsistent on whether or not they accept them or not. So just keep that in mind and do it at your own risk, but do it safely.
One last question about facial recognition. So we didn't go into that, but we did obviously say like to turn off facial recognition on your phone when you're going through TSA. I don't know if worried is the right word, but you can always opt out of facial recognition. I know that you can opt for just a regular screening where, you know, the person just makes sure that your picture on your identity document matches your face so that you don't have to get scanned. You can always opt out of that. So that is your right to opt out of that facial recognition technology. And then with regards to a school question, so if you do go to school currently, like you're flying back to school after spring break or whatever, we do recommend, like, if you wear your, you know, your sweatshirt from whatever school you go to, I don't know, like MIT, Michigan, whatever, the state college, that can help you. Like if you look like a student, you're just this young kid going to and back school and you show that you are affiliated with an institution that's always a plus. It will not hurt you. But as far as other protection goes and what schools can offer you, that's really depends what school you go to. Some schools do, you know, like community colleges offer legal screenings and have lawyers on campus that do support students, but not all campuses have that. So it really depends on where you're going to school.
Yeah, and also just acknowledging that like TSA officers are human, and they could be subjective. Like Dania said, like if looking at the sweater or something like that. I tried that, both traveling domestically or also like I traveled with advanced parole and I used my college sweater. Sometimes that works, sometimes that doesn't. So also just keep that in mind. I like to just go with like what is on paper is like the rule of law. So just like use a TSA acceptable forms of ID as like your traveling Bible. But and also use us as resources in case you have any additional questions. We included on the chat on the slide as well. We have an email address that you can always ask us for additional questions. So it's always good to go by the side of precaution and just go see like what is it that they accept, so that you're able, when you're traveling stress-free and you're just able to have a good time.
Yeah, and then I think we're over time, but just really quickly, I saw there were a few questions that came in about advanced parole, whether traveling with DACA or with TPS. That's beyond the scope of today, right? But there was a training, I believe, that Immigrants Rising did with ILRC last year around advanced parole. That's up. Am I incorrect about that? But there's great resources both on Immigrants Rising and ILRC's website on advanced parole, right? How you could access it, who's eligible, what you could take into consideration. But the most important thing for all of you thinking of traveling, please get screened by an attorney or a DOJ accredited rep before you travel, before you apply. Just because you are leaving the country and you want to make sure that your reentry goes as smooth as possible.
Thank you, Veronica. And on that last note, I put both the websites, immigrationlawhelp.org or alalawyer.com, where you can find legal support. You can also fill out our ILLIS, which is our Immigration Legal Intake Service, and we can provide you a personalized memorandum giving you an overview of potential things you might be eligible for. So that is also on our website. Thank you all so much for tuning in. We will be posting this recording on our YouTube channel and then sharing these resources with folks who registered. So thank you all so much and happy traveling.